I'd like to thank you for this great honor, but especially thank you for letting me go first. At 2 o'clock today, I was in the recovery room at Cornell Weill Hospital. I had surgery this morning. And I went in for, it's a minor procedure, and I was supposed to be, as I told the good doctor, under just propofol. Remember, that was Michael Jackson's milk. And they said, well, there's a possibility we have to do general anesthesia. When I woke up, I went in at 8, I woke up at 2:30, and we had to do general anesthesia. And my wife said, you are not going to any Tenement museum, anything. I go, oh my God, no, I'm afraid of Nina Totenberg. And I'm more afraid of her than I am of you or the anesthesiologist. But I promised I wouldn't have any alcohol. I called Ian, and Ian said, you could go first, and then I'm going to go back to bed over at the Regency Hotel. But I didn't want to miss it. And I'd like to congratulate Steven Seagal. I haven't had the honor of meeting him, but our fellow honorand. And also, I didn't want to miss being able to say publicly how much I love and how much I owe to Vartan Gregorian. Vartan is a truly great and generous human being. In 1991, when I got what turned out to be the job of my dreams, my fantasy job, which was to go to Harvard and build from ground zero a Department of African and African American Studies. The first, and now, I mean, that day there was one professor, and now we have 41 professors, and the largest African language program in the world. I'm very proud of that. That's my day job. That's my day job. But the first person I called was Vartan. And I had met him through, he was provost at Penn and then president at Brown. And I happen to like the Armenian people. I always sign the genocide petition. And I happen to love him. And I called to ask if I should take this job. No one else had been able to, build black studies at Harvard. And he told me, he gave me great advice, and he told me that I should absolutely do it and be serious about it and meet the challenge. And when I came up with the idea, literally from this anesthesia, I feel like I'm on the Sahara Desert, so you gotta let me keep drinking water. When I came up with the idea of what became Finding Your Roots, Vartan, of course, runs Carnegie Corporation. So I went down there to see Uncle Vartan to get advice and to get some shillingi. You know what I'm talking about? And I was hoping he would be so seduced by the idea that he'd plop out that big checkbook of his, which he did. His was the first foundation grant that I got. And it was such a risk. I mean, a crazy idea to walk in and say you want to do a TV show about genealogy and genetics. And when I started, I only did black people. Remember, I did Oprah and Quincy Jones, and one of my former classmates at Yale, I always forget his name, he was a pre-med guy, Ben Carson, yeah, Ben Carson. As one of my nastier friends says, I never trash my friends' ideology. I don't choose my friends by ideology. And I never would trash them in public. And I'd tell Ben what I thought was politics to his face. But as one of my friends likes to say, you knew Ben before he breathed all that ether at all those operations. Down at Johns Hopkins, but that's a whole nother thing. But I knew when Vartan said it was a good idea, I knew it was a good idea. And he put his money where his mouth was. And there wouldn't be a Finding Your Roots without Vartan Gregorian. And I've never been able to say that in public. And I came here to say that. And now, just a few remarks. I want to thank you for this special honor and what it signifies about our shared passion for telling the epic immigration story here in New York City and throughout our great country, these United States. When people visit the Big Apple, they want to sail to the Statue of Liberty to imagine what their ancestors dreamed would be the lives awaiting them here. But when they visit the Tenement Museum, they see how those ancestors lived. And the gap between the two, between their aspirations and their actual everyday struggles, and whether that gap was narrowed, widened, or transformed in one generation or over many generations, or involved an Irish or Italian family, a Jewish or Jamaican family, or more recent immigrants from all around the world, is where the very best stories are found. Unearthing those stories and sharing them with our guests and PBS viewers is what inspires us season after season on Finding Your Roots. It's also what makes walking through the spaces of the Tenement Museum one of the most poignant and affecting experiences anywhere in this country. It's one thing to say that we are a nation of immigrants descended either from the willing or from those unwillingly forced to these shores, but it's quite another to remind ourselves of the prices that were paid, family to family, to become that nation. In his excellent book, which I had never read before preparing these remarks, called City of Dreams, Tyler Anbinder reports, and I quote that, and this was astonishing to me, that the population density of the entire Lower East Side in 1910 was about 625 persons per acre. Even so, that meant that the Lower East Side's 1.35 square miles had more inhabitants in 1900 than the 444,000 square miles of Wyoming, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico combined. Put in modern perspective, he continues, the Lower East Side of 1910 was more than 3 times as densely populated as New York's most crowded neighborhoods today. None of the congested neighborhoods in the world today, anywhere, none, is as densely populated as were the most crowded neighborhoods of the Lower East Side in the decade before World War I. Isn't that astonishing? That is astonishing. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to dedicate the honor that you're presenting me with tonight to those who lived out their lives inside that density, to those who went to work each morning, to those who raised families, to those who endured tragedies and passed into dust in those overwhelmingly crowded spaces of humanity. And also to thank my dear friends, my new friends at the Tenement Museum for giving voice and dignity to those stories. The tenements of the Lower East Side may feel like history to some, but to me, they remain alive in the branches of the family trees of so many of our fellow citizens whom I have the pleasure to meet. May we all remain aware and vigilant of where the Lower East Side of the 1910s are today, along the southern border with Mexico, in refugee camps around the world, and in the overcrowded neighborhoods we hear about but rarely visit. This is for them too, and for the dreams being hatched there against the longest of odds on this very night. Long odds also define the experiment in political democracy known as Reconstruction. The 12 years of hope that followed the American Civil War, when much of the Lower East Side's future as a site of mass immigration from Eastern Europe was still before it. The two were intertwined, of course, as white Americans, North and South, struggled with who could be a citizen and whose rights would be protected by the armor of the United States Constitution. Reconstruction, as David said so eloquently, is the subject of my latest history series on PBS, as well as my latest book, my latest 2 books, one for adults and one for children. It was a grand and glorious period of black freedom, ladies and gentlemen, when African Americans were permanently emancipated by the 13th Amendment, given their citizenship and equal protection under the laws through the 14th, and finally, in 1870, the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. With little warning, however, that glorious period all came crashing down as white Southern Democrats took back power violently in the former Confederate states under the euphemistic banner of redemption. Here in the North, many who'd supported the rights of the freed people pulled back when they discovered that their own anti-immigrant sentiments had more in common with those drawing the Jim Crow color line than they'd originally thought. In both cases, they came to believe perhaps it would be best to let home rule rule. Ladies and gentlemen, the story of Reconstruction and its overthrow, after only a dozen years, shatters all notions that history is a straight line drawn inexorably toward progress. And in that shattering, there is a lesson for us all this evening: vigilance. As we grapple with another rollback following the 8-year presidency of the first African American to hold that office, we cannot escape our own civic duties to preserve the gains we've earned by exercising our vote, holding those in power to account, defending our democratic institutions, and lifting each other up when the will of others becomes sapped and fears and anxieties crowd in. In these turbulent times, without wrestling with the history of Reconstruction and immigration, we cannot make sense of why we needed a civil rights movement 100 years after the Civil War. We cannot gird ourselves for the hard work that democracy requires, and we cannot honor our ancestors who sacrificed all to push for the rights of freedom and equal citizenship long denied. Today, as another day moves toward night here in the United States, we know that we too, those of us, no matter what side of the aisle we sit on, those of us who love freedom and justice, have to draw a line in the sand. We have to defend the right of every American to vote. We must defend the very affirmative action programs that launched many women of all colors and people of color into their positions of authority and power. We must end the madness of mass incarceration and its devastating impact on the African American and Latino community. We must fight for health care as a right for all Americans. And we must keep the pipeline of educational opportunity open for the next generation and the next generation. We must defend the immigrant and the stranger, the impoverished and the forgotten, and speak sensitively and firmly to the fears of those who see globalization as a threat and who worry that the social and cultural progress of those who look different than they will wipe out all that they have known, all that they love. And regardless of our ideological differences, we must link arms and stand or kneel publicly against anti-Semitism, against homophobia, against Islamophobia, against anti-black racism, and ladies and gentlemen, against white supremacist ideology in all of its ugly, hideous forms. This is no time for equivocation or false equivalences. This is a time for truth. We know that the work is not over. We cannot allow the forces of reaction to turn back the clock on American race relations, obliterating the heroic efforts of legions of Americans, white and black, Asian and Latino, Jewish and Christian, Muslim, Hindu, gay, straight, and trans, who risked and sometimes tragically and nobly gave their lives to make certain that the arc of the moral universe bent toward justice. Too many hands today are trying to bend that arc back in another direction. And those of us who love truth and justice and the principles of democracy upon which this great nation of ours was founded must stand against those forces just as our immigrant ancestors did. May we find inspiration and hope in the Reconstruction generation and in the generations who made their way to the Lower East Side. May we also find courage even when the tide is rolling against us. With history as our guide, we will not be turned back. Thank you for honoring me this evening.